Oh, good. It speaks. So let me introduce this panel about the relationship between economic power and political power. Before we start, I have to apologize us because Professor Sassen hasn't arrived. I think it must be something to do with the global capitalism conspiracy, that she was stopped somewhere over the ocean and she didn't make it to Prague. But I still hope that we will have an exciting discussion on the topic. So let me introduce our two panelists. The first is Veronika Angel, who is working for Johns Hopkins University as a researcher, and her research is in political science and on the processes of democratization in Central and Eastern Europe. And on the other side, we have Abdu Al-Kabsi, the managing director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, who kindly agreed to replace Saskia. So the instructions I got as a moderator was not to give a long introduction, but because we do not have two other panelists who are supposed to come, because some of you might be interested in having Minister for Social Affairs, Jana Maláčová, but she also sent her apologies. She couldn't make it because I suppose there is one of the many crises in the Czech government, so she has something else to do than to sit with us here in Žofín. So let me just say a few words about how this panel and the topic was conceived. So what I would like to hear from our panelists with their different backgrounds and also experiences, territories they work in and focus on, is this difficult topic of today, which is to what extent the economic power is properly understood in today's world, and what is its relationship to politics. Because it seemed to me, when I was trying to work on the topic for this panel, that very often, or at least until quite recently, what we thought was that with democracy, free markets come somewhat in good relationship, and that there is a self-supporting mutual understanding between the two systems. But increasingly, and we can see it on many sorts of phenomena, we see that we here talks about the upper 1% who is taking control over the politics. Then on the other hand, we see that, or we hear that political elites are corrupted and that there is an unhealthy relationship between economy on the one hand and those who are in politics on the other. And in the end, we see a really interesting coming together of the two in the persons such as Donald Trump, who is someone who made a fortune in the economic system and now holds also the economic power. But we see the same phenomenon across Europe, including this small country. So that's the ideas which are behind this panel, and this idea to discuss the relationship between the economic power and the political power, and to what extent the politics can tame economy or can somewhat regulate economy, and whether we should not rethink what has been a dogma since 1989 until at least the global financial crisis. So if I may, I would start with Veronika, if you have some thoughts on this.
Thank you, Jan. I think that we should start by thanking our colleagues for being present and sticking with us so late in the conference program and not being outside taking advantage of this incredible city. But this is undoubtedly the most important panel of the forum because, dealing with the conversation and on the institutional design of political and economic institutions is rivals with the theory of everything. So I will try to offer one possible explanation to link the two, although it needs some simplification because of time. So one fundamental assumption that we have about democracy is that it requires boundaries between state and business. And that although the two dimensions can complement each other, their interests do not always align. So there was plenty of room for experiments in the institutional vacuum that came with the 1989 transition to democracy and the new institutions of democracy, multiple political parties, the separation of powers, were being imported and assembled at a fast-forward pace. The requirements of the elites that were just scrambled on the ground were very high. And although the end goal of building democracy was very clear, the immediate effects of these institutions were not. So uncertainty and lack of immediate functionality of the state was often met with improvisation. In this process, we see increasing evidence, even in our research, that political elites, decision makers, and even the public cut many corners and circumvented the boundaries that were supposed to be set in place between state and business by allowing also informal mechanisms to compensate for the lack of functionality of these new institutions in the first years of transition. Even the international organizations that were present on the ground, if you speak with representatives of the IMF or the World Bank who were present, they would admit that there was a significant confusion what to do, but also the pressures were very high on how to deliver. It was pretty much building the ship at sea, democracy and liberal markets at the same time. In this context, a narrow range of groups concentrated gain while imposing substantial costs on the population as a whole. At the same time, the institutions that had been imported were having their own effect and constrained the actions of this privileged elite. Some examples such as proportional voting that required parties to now enter negotiations and build coalitions. This was something new that needed to be learned. Judicial oversight that came with the separation of powers, free media that led to investigative journalism, the free markets that incentivized competition, the free borders that brought in foreign investment or foreign direct investment and foreign capital. So these democratic elites were locked in a dance of necessity and negotiation with the democratic institutions themselves. And they did try to maintain the privileges that were assigned with their position. So the mechanisms through which this was perpetuated was the long-term building of these informal networks of authority that we now see surrounding the elites in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria, that we refer to all the time as this mix between business and politics. These informal networks of authority substituted the formal role of institutions while maintaining them as a hallowed shell. It's one thing to have the institution of a prosecutor if it's not enforced. It's one thing to have rules for the distribution of resources if they're not followed, or to have a bureaucracy that is supposed to support the administration if they are not built on some sort of rules of competition. And this is pretty much where we are, and I think that this is we can assess that discreetly but surely the expected outcomes of the process of liberal democratization were altered by this process, and in order to preserve their privilege, the elites turned to modifying these institutions. And this is the stage of the game where we are, and I believe that this is an important tipping point. If they succeed, then democratic institutions will go through a very significant trouble in Central and Eastern Europe.
So do you want to react to it?
I will leave it to that.
No, sure. I'll just comment. First of all, I want to apologize for everybody. If you were expecting Saskia Sassen, I'm not. So I apologize. Listening to you, Veronica, and I was trying very hard to find something to disagree with. You want to be provocative and to have a discussion. There isn't a lot we disagree on. But let me state a few facts. Economic power has had influence over politics for a very, very long time, maybe through the Stone Age. If you controlled the means of productions, your voice was louder, was stronger, and you had more influence. So it's nothing new. Something else is when we talk about economic power and its influence over politics, it is a serious problem today, and we need to regulate it. We need to change it, because right now, it is not just money spent in Czechia by Czechs. It's not just money spent by Americans in the United States. Right now, we have Russians and Chinese and people from all bad actors from around the world influencing elections in the democratic world. And that's, in my opinion, a much more dangerous escalation than just money within a country. And I want to be a little provocative here also. When we talk about money and influence of money in politics and the influence of economic powers in politics, we tend to forget labor unions. Labor unions are an economic power. They also have an oversized influence over politics. Some of it is very good, but some of it is bad. It's also as economic power as the business, as the private sector side. Again, I'm saying this to be provocative, to add, to expand the discussion. Another point I'd like to add is, when we are not happy with a political figure, in the United States, we tend to be very happy with Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post being involved in politics, but not somebody on the other side. We tend to be happy when a Bill Gates, Melinda and Bill Gates are involved in world affairs and what they do, but not people on the other side. So it is dangerous. It is affecting politics in an oversized kind of way. It needs to be regulated. But we also need to be fair and try to make it a level playing field for everybody. To remove it completely, I think, is impossible. I think we'll be barking up the wrong tree. We need to regulate it, we need to monitor it through better campaign finance laws and how that is used. Right now, a corporation can spend millions and millions of dollars in the United States supporting one candidate over another without any regulation over it. Do I agree with that completely? No. We need to have some regulation over that. But at the same time, if you do this, you also have to regulate the influence of labor unions over politics too.
All right, I'm just a moderator, so I have
please get engaged.
Questions or reactions. But before I have them, then would Veronica want to add or react to something what Abdu has just said?
Yes, the idea that the labor unions, mostly I'm referring to the case study of Central and Eastern Europe, because this is such a laboratory of change, and we have tested so many of our theories, unfortunately, on these countries. And the idea that the labor unions have too much power is definitely not something that is happening in this region. The labor unions have been significantly undercut by the changes of 1989. They are highly fragmented, and they do not have the kind of power that you refer to. But I'm glad that you are controversial to bring them, to wanting to bring them in. At the same time, this idea was of having some sort of collective action to preserve the right of income earners. The rights of income earners is actually something that we should pay more attention to and not less. Mm-hmm. Because, as you say, there is a need absolutely for regulation. And when you say we're happy when Bill Gates gets involved, we're not always happy when Bill Gates gets involved. I remember that there was a significant discussion about whether he has a monopoly over technology for a significant time. But of course, no one wants Bill Gates not to get involved in his actions of philanthropy and technology, which is another point that we need to address. But yes, for sure, the different actors that need to compete and build functional, competitive democracies need to have the regulation of both labor unions, states, the interests of business. The problem is, and this is the case I was trying to make, that when business and state overlap and they cater for the same interests, that is a significant problem, and that is one of the problems that we're facing now in Central and Eastern Europe.
I agree. I just have no issue with that. When they overlap, yes, there's a role for business, there's a role for labor, there's a role for government. The institutions have to be the arbitrator in all of this. I agree. I have no issues with that.
Right, so it seems to me that you share the analysis that the main problem is a sort of state capture by business or by the economic power, as it is called in the title of this panel. But the question I would like to invite you to reflect on is also the question concerning, so to what extent the state or the public power, the political power needs to regulate economy so that we can maintain democracy. So what Veronica was talking about was in a way a template which was being used for all the post-communist transformations throughout the 1990s in the belief that you somewhat built on the one hand free markets, competitive markets and liberal democracy, and that the two would mutually support each other. And there seems to be a more general assumption in liberal democratic thought, which is that the state's intervention in economy should be minimal, so that at most they would just maintain the conditions for the free competition so that enterprise can strive. But wouldn't you think that what at least last 10, 15 years have taught us, there seems to be a problem with too much of a concentration of economic power that, to just put it very bluntly, you get some too wealthy people that they do not need the democratic system anymore. So they then go and capture the state system, or they simply just build their own structures of governance, so that you have private security companies, you have simply people who are somewhat outside the democratic system. They buy their way out from democracy because they are simply too rich to care about rules which people adopt in common, which is to me a slightly different problem than the one you've been talking about, which is a state capture by businesses.
Yeah.
So what would be your thoughts on this problem?
Up to you.
So the role of the state, this is a huge conversation, and any answer that you give may put you on one side of the debate or on the other. But the requirements of the new age that we live in is to be on neither sides. So thinking that the state can have a regulatory capacity does not necessarily mean that it's not a liberal thought. Just one, give me notices. The state is a major donor in some of the most important technological innovations, for example, that we have at this moment, or they were the initial donors in some of the most interesting startups and ideas. But this is, in my view, sort of a swan song for the state, because in the process of investing in technologies and in the process of investing in supranational institutions such as the EU, the state is erasing itself from being relevant anymore. So what we are seeing right now is a significant challenge coming, of course, from nationalism and all these voices that we need to address, but there's a significant challenge in explaining 21st century problems with tools devised in the 18th and 19th century, and the nation state is one of them. The challenges that we're facing right now, climate change, trade, migration, they can no longer be addressed with the power of such small units, particularly in Europe. I'm sorry, I apologize for being so Eurocentric, but it's what I know best to talk about. And from this point of view, although I'm not challenging the premises of your conversation that liberalism versus more state involvement is still an important talk, we can benefit from shifting this question towards how best to utilize the state while pretty much accepting that it is no longer a relevant way of addressing issues.
Let me just add to that a little bit. Even, it's not just liberals, even libertarians would not tell you that the state has no role. The role of the state is absolutely important in regulations, in consumer protection, in a lot of things. There's a major role for the state to play in. The question, and it's, in my opinion also, it's cyclical. At certain times we need a more interventionist state. We need, just maybe this is the time in Europe when it's needed, while the United States maybe lags behind. But where is it in that spectrum the state should be engaged? I don't have an answer for you. It's not always that clear. Some of the solutions right now, and I agree with Veronica completely, the size of problems we have right now is no longer possible for any state to take care of completely. Is public-private partnerships the way to move forward on health, on education, on transportation, and all of these services? Is that the model we go? Again, I don't have an answer for you, but there is a role of the state, and at different historical points, there are different points of intervention for the state, and every country will decide where is that differently, and it will change in maybe every 4-year cycle. We'll need to find another answer, and we will not solve that at all in the near future.
Mm-hmm. So let's just not have a debate about the state, because it's perhaps a too loaded term, but we cannot, I think, just put aside this debate on the need to have a sort of public structure through which people can exercise their freedom. Now, that's what I think we see with the rise of populism, the pressures from the people who are left behind, as they are now being called, that they do not see that their freedom can be realized through the institutional structures as they exist. And one of the means of the oppression, I think they would say, is the economic injustice, so something which comes from the economical system. So would your analysis be then that we only need to somewhat make the existing institutions and paradigms better so that the system somewhat cares for these people again? But in principle, it is possible with the system of free trade, with supranational institutions, with state structures, even if they are just disappearing, but they are still there, and they would somewhat remain. We may not be calling them the state, but some sort of institutional expression of the public power will exist. So would your analysis be that, well, we just need to think a little bit harder how to make some changes in the system, but that it is in principle possible, and that the problem is not really that the system as such produces these tensions so that many people are left behind? Now, to put it in somewhat perhaps less abstract terms, so essentially what you say is that, well, essentially people get their freedom through being competitive, going to the market, right? Mm-hmm. Being entrepreneurial, they can just succeed there. But what if just it's not what they wish or they have their capacity to do? Then what remains is this sort of political. But if political disappears, then what they are left with?
I mean, you talked about those left behind in a certain kind of way that assumes linearity. That it's because of globalization. We talk about this all the time. We had a conversation about that earlier. You know, globalization that lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, that offered opportunity, allowed countries like India to compete with the United States and the Western world. But these people, especially in the industrialized world, in manufacturing sector, feel left behind. That's why the anger, that's why we have populism. Again, it's a theory. Frank Fukuyama talked about it and others talked about it. And so that's a problem that we have to solve. These people who are left behind. And what do we do about it? But that, again, that assumes a linear relationship between globalization, between these, and the people who are working on it and why they're angry. It's a lot more complex than that. Even without this happening, automation alone would have kicked a lot of these people out and they've lost their jobs. I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry, Jan. How do we solve this problem? Again, you need state intervention, they need training, they need placement in other places. It's not only what they choose. The world is changing around them, the world is changing around us, and we need new creative solutions for them. They're creating enough pressure right now. I don't know if you know, but in the United States alone right now, more young people want strong leaders than democratic leaders. So democracy is in danger because of all of this. And yes, there is a role for the state to play here. There is a role for them to create training programs, place them somewhere else. And it's not only about choices, it's what's available. The market will decide where they go, and they have to try to fit themselves someplace.
Mm-hmm. You know, when we're looking for new solutions, it's difficult to find new solutions when you're using tools that are not new. And one of the problems with populism as a, let's say, analytical category is that it's not something new and it distracts the attention from wider, deeper problems. Populism is just, a word that we use now in the 21st century for Athenian demagoguery. It's just a rhetorical gimmick that can be used at different degrees by all political parties. And of course it works. It works because we prefer, we want to be charmed, sobriety doesn't make for a good party if you take these issues more seriously. And we have increasingly, we do not find that much evidence in political science research, for example, that connects populism with a specific type of voter profile. The same kind of issues also direct people to vote for mainstream parties. Populist voters are not necessarily more volatile. They don't have a particular set of needs that can be addressed by a particular type of party. However, people do have these populist attitudes that connect them with a specific party that you call populist, if we are to accept it. And in this process, they feel somehow represented. So the people that you refer to as the ones that are left behind, it's not necessarily a category that we can use to explain what's going on. What we can see is that why do people accept being lied to? That's one question. And the fact is that they're used to it. We are used to it. We are used to the kind of normalization of behavior from political elites that allows them to think that we are also, as voters, as the public, part of this rigged game, in the sense that, okay, but we can also benefit from informality. We can also, in Central and Eastern Europe, still have some people you can get to call to escape some sort of bureaucratic trap, or get an earlier appointment to the doctor, or move your kid to a better school, or untaxed tips, or this sort of things. And you just think that in a different degrees, corrupt attitudes of politicians are pretty much something, it's the same. But the stakes are so different, and while they are at the high rollers table, we are just happy to make some extra bucks playing bridge at our grandma's club. And that makes the whole situation very different, and that's one of the ways to look at why is it acceptable to have these kind of elites that are clearly using and the leverages of businesses empowered for personal self-interest at the expense of a better life for the population.
If I can follow up with this, Jan,
sure,
very quickly. Populism is not a political ideology. I agree. Populism is a methodology to get votes, right? It's a way to do things, not a political ideology. So I want to set that aside. But I have myself, I have a problem with the title of the session here, right? So it assumes a dichotomy between democracy and economic power. It assumes that saving it from that. I think we're addressing the wrong problem. I don't think economic power is the problem itself, like I started early on. Some economic power is good. I mean, when businesses that we work with in Thailand organize themselves, small, medium, and larger multinational companies organize together to fight corruption, they were able to win through collective action. So sometimes economic power is a force of good. Actually, in my opinion, my very humble opinion, most of the time, economic power can be a power for good. In developing world, entrepreneurship, when you develop entrepreneurs, they have stronger voices, they become more active in politics. I think the problem is the misuse of economic power. I think the problem is corruption, and if we do not address corruption, opacity in political competition, then we won't solve it. So the enemy is not economic power, and we do not need to save democracy from economic power. We need to save democracy from the misuse of economic power and from corruption. That's where the problem is, and I think that's where the title should have been, but it would not have been so provocative.
Now I feel the need to somewhat defend the title, and that's essentially, again, going back to the question I had in the beginning. So to me, we have a problem with people who maybe even obeying all the rules, but essentially are too rich just simply not to play by the rules, by the game, or care for others.
But what's too rich?
Now, the ones who simply do not need democratic institutions anymore to have good life, right? If I am someone who is just living as an employee, I am depending on many sorts of rules so that I am kept in a decent life. If I'm just wealthy, I do not need to care about it. I'm now unmasking myself and my political leanings, I know.
Yeah.
But with this notion of economic power and the logic behind it, so I think you can translate it into the notion of running politics as the business or as a firm. So the ultimate goal in economy is to get profit. That's what you want. In democracy or in politics, it's different because you simply need to live together. You have to find conditions for people living together, and you care not only for your profit or the profit of your shareholders, but unfortunately also need to care for the dump, for those who do not know to work, who are not qualified, because they simply happen to live in the same political system as you. And in the democratic system, you simply cannot exclude them, and what is worse, you have to treat them as your equals. And that's what I think you do not have in the economic system.
Well, that's,
go ahead.
It's difficult to think about the possibility not to have it in this way, as long as these institutions are maintained. Because think about it, we look at our prime ministers, at our presidents as some sort of CEOs, that we administer them this function of being managerial. Of course, we talk sometimes about whether they should have vision, responsibility, higher purpose than their own self-individual interests. But is this really realistic? There are political elites that are self-interested. And also what we see in Central and Eastern Europe, is it in their self-interest to accept the rules of the democratic game? No. It's not. Right now they're winning by not accepting these rules. Whether these rules will come back to them and incur a new cost, then the institutions of democracies have won in the long term. But now that they have seen some sort of gaps in the system, like you said, usually through some sort of economic, political schemes, combinations of it, through which they empower themselves to preserve this privilege that they have. And it is rational for them to do that. And as long as there are no new incentives and disincentives for them to do it, they will continue doing it. That's the problem. If we accept some sort of, if we want this sort of vision from our politicians, it's not really the right era probably to ask that of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll come to it from a different angle. Maybe I'm the naive American coming into all of this, not as sophisticated as your systems here. But to be rich enough to be independent of the state, I think should be the dream of everybody. I do not want to depend on the state on anything. That's a dream, to be independent of the state. And to push for against self-interest, again, as an American, everything is driven by self-interest. Even when you do something good, you feel good about it. So the drive through self-interest is a healthy thing, and we should encourage it. There's nothing against it. So I don't see the problem. I don't see where the problem. And then the arbitrariness of us deciding how rich a person can be, or how rich a corporation can be, that will tilt the power so much to the state that we bring back some kind of other form of communism. We need to be careful what we wish for. We lived under that arbitrariness, distribution of wealth, and we decide, the state decides what kind of vegetable you're going to get today. I don't know if that's healthy anymore. So healthy competition is good as long as it's regulated by a good state that's elected by the people. I do not have a problem with it. I really don't. And I don't see what the problem is.
Yeah.
The ugly American in the room.
Just a note, I think you've said you're from America, so I don't think you lived in the conditions of communism, and I doubt that anybody in Central and Eastern Europe did. But that's a really different debate.
No, please, don't act just as a moderator. Challenge, come back. I really would love to hear from you.
I see that there are some reactions from the audience already, and there is a microphone hidden in the ball, I was told.
Yeah, they throw it at
I suppose you are not expected to catch them when it is being thrown on you.
Have I been provocative enough for people to jump in?
That's the best we could get, even without Saskia.
I think this is what you call cultural appropriation.
So I will just collect people and to give microphone to. So I saw the two gentlemen here, and there were two people behind me. So can you just raise your hands so that I can make a sort of order?
All right.
It was being repaired for a moment.
All right. So can we start over there, because this gentleman over there was the first, I think.
I have to talk.
And if you can briefly introduce yourself before you put your question, comment.
So I'm Paul van Beveren, retired and independent of the state. But
congratulations.
I could make a lot of remarks, but I have a question. If I travel through the suburbs of Atlanta, they are the most poor suburbs I know, even comparing with Johannesburg, okay, to make a kind of extreme. So, how do you take care about those people? You let them die in the guts, meaning the US should be the country of hope and success. But it's probably one of the poorest countries in the West. So how does the US, or how do you as a person feel about these other American citizens?
You want me to answer this one?
Yeah, we have enough time, I guess.
Sure. Poverty, I don't know where you read in my comments that a society, through its elected people, should not take care of every poor person. If there is one person who cannot eat in the United States, it's a crime. And we should take more taxes and take care of them. So that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is putting arbitrary limits on wealth. It might be a good thing, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work. That's all I'm saying. So saying somebody is too rich, I don't know what too rich is. Who decides that? Do we get a committee here together and decide that somebody's too rich? But again, I will repeat, poverty is not acceptable. And if there's one poor person, whether in Atlanta, I live around Washington, D.C., and I see poor people, I see homeless people, and I see kids who do not have enough to eat. And civil society tries to take care of that. But that's a responsibility of the society through its elected officials to take care of every poor person in the country. That's unrelated to economic power and whether that's good or bad. Again, economic power can be good and it can be bad. It's the misuse of it, the abuse of it that is bad.
Abdullah, you're wrong.
Good.
There is such a thing as being too rich. And the answer to that is solidarity. Solidarity works in the sense that it's efficient, and it is in the self-interest even of the rich to have a redistribution of resources at some point, because you cannot be too rich until the end. You will have to redistribute some of the resources in order to cater for the richness that you already have. It is not logically supportive.
So what's too rich? What's too rich? Who decides?
Well, the outcome of an imbalanced system brings about the rich, right?
Yeah.
So you don't really have, and it's not just a cost of economic cost. I don't want to take over the conversation, but it's a cost, it's a symbolic cost nowadays. You don't necessarily associate your happiness with materialism anymore, right? So there's post-materialism is really a thing in Europe these days. But it hasn't really reached across the Atlantic. Yeah. And it's something that is also in your self-interest that goes beyond your economic achievements.
Of course. But again, I think we should focus on fighting corruption. That is the key to everything we're talking about is about corruption, and we should focus on that.
I'm from Romania. We're totally on top of that.
So we have someone else there with their question, comment.
Thank you. Giuseppe Mastruzzo, Director of the International University College of Turin. I'd like to support the moderator's viewpoint that there is such a thing as being too powerful. I would like to redefine wealth and make it power. Example, and also I would like to expand very briefly on the concept of corruption. Monopoly can be a corruption. So perhaps, Abdul, you have something to say on monopoly instead of corruption. One of the things that now we are experiencing is the privatization of law. Example, which touches on everyone. On Facebook, you can be blocked by some obscure employee without the right to appeal, because it is seen as a private club, a private space, but in fact it is not. Once billions use it, that becomes a public space that must be regulated by public bodies. So power is a category that lends itself to being too much in the hands of too few, unruled, unregulated people, and I'd like you to respond.
Take some more.
So
should we get some more questions, maybe?
I think we can just react to it. I see one more hand here. There are two waiting, yes?
Yeah, we have time. Go ahead.
Unless you want to become a moderator.
No, no, no.
Good.
It's difficult. I don't disagree. I don't disagree that in any way you're absolutely right, and there's a lot of evidence and studies that really point us in the direction that, you know, that huge companies such as Facebook need to be regulated by the state, and that there is no powerful enough actor right now that can, you know, hold to the power of Facebook. We can't do it as individual citizens unless we decide ourselves not to participate in it. But that incurs different kinds of costs. So, but the conversation has really provided some outcomes in the case of Facebook that may not satisfy many people, and that definitely we need to integrate them as non-state actors in all of our analysis. But also, it's not fair to say that you are being blocked on Facebook by obscure employees. And they are actual, they're the people with expertise in these regions. So if you look at the exact way that these things operate, and they are speakers of the language that they are blocking. There are not enough manpowers, of course. There are a lot of algorithms that need to be satisfied. But these are investments in technology that incur risk, and it's a trial and error, and it's part of our heuristics right now. We cannot look at technology as anything but part of our future in the positive way.
Giuseppe, you're absolutely right. Monopoly is a serious form of corruption that we need to deal with. The solution to that, though, is that right now our legal and regulatory environment needs to be upgraded to catch up where the technology is. Our rules of the game right now are used to deal with oil companies, maybe with the transport, with the train companies, you know, but not where the technology is. And the problem is the internet and technology is rapidly moving much faster than the laws can catch up. And we have a serious problem, and we need to solve that. That's very true.
All right,
by
so
we,
shall we...
if the we is the state, it won't manage in the end, in the sense that the Facebook is cross-border, it's too much, it's too big. Romania can't handle Facebook. Not even the US can handle Facebook.
Yes.
This is something that has to be cross-national.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right, so let's move over here. We have 4 people at least on this side. So that they are not left behind. My back.
Yeah, my name is Jaroslav Horák. I'm from this country, and I would like to put discussion into the regional context again. I think the name of the panel is very logical in the regional context, and I would use the same word as the gentleman before. The problem is not that people that are too rich, but the people who are rich and too powerful in the same time, and they can attack the liberal democracy. They can attack the rule of law. They can attack the free media and basically the accountability institutions. So that normally in a normal society you have, if there is theft or corruption, they are punished or disclosed at least, and they can tweak the rules so that it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. And if it is linked to, if it takes a long time, then the people get tired, and even the election, they get used to it in a way, and then you have, populists winning, yeah, who simply win election based on some social redistributions. And I don't know whether I don't see an easy recipe here how to change it. I don't know whether you see any. In the US, it's much easier because you may have attempts like this, but you have very strong institutions. Yeah. The institutions are young. Mm-hmm. So do you have any idea, how to deal with that?
So maybe we can, just leave the question who is too rich for another revolution and just focus on the question how to regulate the rich and how to force them to do things they do not want to do. So we would like them to express solidarity. They do not seem, at least not all of them, be willing to do so. Some are escaping these by having these tax havens. So that would be already quite an achievement. If we just brought the wealth they generate under the overseen or oversight of the rules which we adopted in the political system, that I think would be something we can do, we should be doing, right? Yeah. And sure.
The answer is the same. It is solidarity, but a solidarity that is no longer built exclusively on passion, wanting to help the other, wanting to help the poorer people or the people in the suburbs of Atlanta with this speech. Solidarity based on reason. It is absolutely necessary to help people and bridge the gap of the inequality gap between the lower earning income people and those who have a higher wealth, not necessarily income. Because this is not a sustainable system. It will crash. It cannot resist. So if we were to reframe the conversation based on reason and not passion, I think this is one point that we can bring solidarity back into the game and see the opportunities that come with risk. Also, in the case of our own experience with European integration, we required a lot of solidarity from older member states for the East and redistribution of resources and patience. And they're running out of patience in a way, but this is a change of, it's a double standard in a way, because even this solidarity and integration in a higher European structure was something that they accepted with this cutting of corners on both sides and incomplete solutions of reform, both on the side of the EU and on the side of the new countries that were less affluent. And now all of a sudden we are surprised that Hungary did not become Austria in 30 years or Romania did not become France. I mean, how can we be surprised? We so often forget how young these democracies are, and we so often forget how young liberal democracy is. So we still need to have some sort of, it's not necessarily faith, but patience and determination to pursue the path that we are on with new tools.
My name is Jaroslav Andel. I have a question for Veronica about this new problem, old toolkit. Right? New problem, new old tool or toolkit, right? And revisiting this story you were talking about privatization, transition to capitalist economy in Central Eastern Europe, right? So you might remember this notion of shock therapy, right? So was shock therapy a new tool or old tool for a new problem?
Well, that's definitely an experience that Romania went through, the shock therapy and the requirement of privatization that was badly carried and very late in the game, as opposed to, let's say, the earlier start of privatization in Hungary. This was an improvised tool, right? So it was an improvised solution to a problem of trying to do something that worked in some conditions and take it from there and put it in the completely different conditions of a country like Romania and say now privatize, be democratic, and everything is done. And of course it didn't work. And it didn't work for Hungary either, because this is a long process. So the errors that were done, because this was a very fast-forward process that was sort of built in the improvised and in the experiment of the 90s, we are now have to deal with their outcomes. And one of the outcomes is this new accumulation of domestic capital that was brought on through corrupt means. That was also a part of the shock therapy.
That was a regional question, so. Okay, she did well.
All right, so we have a member of the audience over there.
Rainer Adam, Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. I don't agree with your views on income disparity and the solutions to it, but I want to come back to the question of abuse of economic power and the reinstatement of competition in the market. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have the tools, I believe. If you look at, and if you look historically, when Standard Oil was destroyed, who had a monopoly on, let's say, energy, not only in the US market, also globally at the time, let's say, antitrust laws were applied, and Standard Oil was destroyed into many, many different competing entities, and we had tremendous economic growth and the creation of wealth afterwards at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, we are in the 21st century, not in the 20th century. However, I believe that at the EU level, we have antitrust regulations which could be used to, for instance, to bring competition into the markets and to face the Googles and face Facebook and others who may be abusing their market power, not paying taxes, not giving back to society what they actually should. Mm-hmm. You haven't mentioned antitrust regulation at all in your discussion.
Yes.
Maybe you can refer to this.
Thank you for bringing this up. And it was not just Standard Oil, it was the telephone company, AT&T, Mobile at the same time was broken down. I don't want to use the word destroyed. It was just broken down into healthier pieces and survived and thrived, actually. There's a lot of talk right now in the United States, and some of the Democratic candidates are putting into their own program the idea of using antitrust laws. I think Senator Warren heads that list, of using antitrust laws to break down these big internet-based companies, Google, Facebook, you name it. The problem is, like Veronica said earlier, is these are no longer entities that can just break up as easily as they did with Standard Oil or with AT&T. It's a much more complex entity right now to do that. I think you will find a lot of support everywhere for breaking these down into different sectors. Right now they're involved in everything. Amazon alone, and what it does to small, and we talk about economic power, Amazon's economic power killed the economic power of so many thousands of small mom and pop shops and small businesses and medium businesses. We need a way to protect the other economic power, the smaller one. And so yes, you'll find a lot of sympathy with a lot of people like me in the United States in this is becoming too powerful. Amazon is now getting into the grocery business. They own Whole Foods, not just distribution. So yes, antitrust laws can be used. How? I still don't know. I can't answer you.
You mentioned that you didn't agree with at the beginning. No, I see, but by the end of your comment you accepted that there are antitrust laws at the level of the EU, not at the level of the nation state. The EU can use it. Yes, not individual nation states. Oh, okay.
All right. So.
Hello, my name is Natalia Otsel-Bellan. I am with the Center for International Private Enterprise. I actually worked with Abdu. But I have a question for the panel. So we're talking about the super wealthy, and we are, make an assumption that the super wealthy are also super powerful because they have an influence over politics. But it seems to me that we're not thinking about the value of the rule of law. And so I want to ask you the question, rule of law is an essential part of any democratic system. And if let's say, the rule of law needs to, to regulate what's happening in business, what's happening in government, and, if we are assuming that the overpowerful, of the overreach, they got there not based on merit, but maybe based on some privilege or preferential treatment, if they circumvented the rule of law to get into that position of being powerful over the political system or having that oversized economic power, then we need to see whether did they get in that position of privilege by circumventing, violating the law, did they commit any corruption and any other, let's say, violations of the rules of the game. So the role of government is really to be able to apply equally the rule of law to any type of companies, be that small or big. And so, the government should, so I think that in this case is that, the rich people, if we're looking at them, are they rich because they violated the law, or are they rich because they, they earned it through their hard work and merit?
So again, it's a comment, a contribution rather than a question, but I suppose, do you want to add something to the importance of the rule of law? Me being a professor of law, I cannot just but agree, almost.
Can I ask you that question? Really, you're a professor of law. What do you think? Can you contribute to the conversation by telling us what you think about this?
What I think about this relationship between the political power and the the economic power.
Yes.
Well, one thing I would add, but I think we touched on that, and that's this question of the separation between them. And Veronika mentioned the separation of powers as one of the basic principles of the democratic liberal government. Well, I think what we need to talk about is also the need to separate economical power and political power. And one example would be the campaign finance. So essentially, if you make the wealthy, let's not talk about the super wealthy, but simply you transform almost directly your economic power into the political power. The more you have to pay, the better outcome you get in politics. So that's something where I think many people would agree there is a place for the rule of law and also for rethinking of the relationship between economic and political power. Because as the rule of law stands currently in the United States, as you know, that's now possible. And it's deemed problematic by many democratic observers.
Yes.
It's possible that at some points we overstretch the concept of the rule of law, because circumventing the rule of law is not necessarily illegal. And if you change the rule of law from the position of a leader, I mean, if you change the laws, you may do it in a sort of lawful procedural way. The problem with the rule of law is that it's not exclusively made of procedures, the way you interpret it. And it can be sometimes very ambiguous, and unless you do it in good faith, then you can have rule of law because you respect procedures and you are democratically elected, and you can change organic law, you can change the constitution by giving yourself more rights, and that's not enough. Just by understanding rule of law as regulation, then we can enter a trap where we are actors in challenging our own rights, democratic rights.
I think we have about 2-3 minutes left, so just if you have one very last and very quick question, and you are the first I saw.
Martin Ras. Very quick question. Is there still a rule of law in the United States? By which, of course, I'm getting at President Trump and the fact that the political system and the balance of current politics in the United States makes him effectively immune from the rule of law.
Is that for me?
So is there And I would add, is there freedom in the United States?
I'm going to take that question very seriously and answer it seriously. Rule of law is not a box you check, is it or isn't it? It's a flexible thing that needs to develop with times. And let me tell you now, in addition to what Veronica said about rule of law being sets of procedures, it's also norms. You know, there are certain norms in the United States political system that just presidents do this and presidents do that, political figure does this and does that, doesn't do that, that these norms that are not codified in a set of laws passed by Congress are now being broken. And so the next step, in my opinion, if you follow the news in the United States, the political developments, that a lot of these norms that people were just used to, a president doesn't do this, a president does that, will be codified, will become law. I'm a strong believer in the American political system. I'm a strong believer in the American Constitution. I'm a strong believer that things can be fixed and amended and done well in the future. That's why the United States has survived worse political climates than we have today. And it will survive it, don't worry about it. It'll work out.
So I take it also as the final statement by Abdu. And I hope we have 1 minute to close still. Just very last remarks, if you want to add, Veronica, and I'm pressed by the organizers that we need to finish unless they shoot me.
I would stress again what I mentioned at the beginning, that this is a very important tipping point in our democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. And it comes in the larger context of the need to find innovations to address new challenges that were just not present 200 years ago when we developed the tools that we are using right now. And one of them being the idea of national sovereignty and nationalism as being an answer to the problems that we are facing today. That is not the way forward.
All right, so thank you very much for coming, for making for a wonderful debate, even without Saskia. And thank you also to the audience for being with us and having the questions.
Thank you.